1998. It was a wonderful year. It was the year of the Backstreet Boys and the Spice Girls, the year Pokemon began to take over the lives of everyone's children, the year the president had been caught cheating with an intern, and most importantly, of course, it was the year Hollywood made its ill-fated first attempt at adapting Japan's most famous giant monster for Western audiences. It was an exciting time, not just for Godzilla fans, but for general moviegoers who were being blitzkrieged with an exhaustive and highly elaborate marketing campaign that used Godzilla's size and new closely guarded modern design to intrigue your grandparents enough into thinking, maybe we should check out that new Godzilla movie our grandson won't shut up about.
2 hours later.
Well, that was a bit shit. Indeed, as a young 9-year-old lad in the thick of his quickly burgeoning Godzilla fandom when this film came out, I can safely say that there was nothing quite like the lead up to the 1998 Godzilla. Whatever you may think of the film now, no one can deny how hype the marketing was. There was the billboards, the posters, the commercials, the Taco Bell kids meals, the toys that spoiled the design. Everything was so expertly coordinated. You had to be there. I can't really do it justice. Anyway, like any good blockbuster film, a pillar of this marketing was the tie-in novelization. There were multiples, actually. There was the junior novelization, which obviously was geared more towards children and preteens, and then there was the official novelization for the adults and those with higher reading levels. I, being an obsessive fan, of course read both, and I remember enjoying them, particularly the official novelization, mostly because it offered what to me felt like an alternate version of the movie. Movie novelizations are an interesting breed of literature. Oftentimes they are based on older versions of a script, and so diverge in significant ways. And even if they are based on the final script, they almost always contain scenes or moments that were deleted during editing, and so reading the novel is usually a surefire way to witness these deleted scenes in some capacity. Most interesting, though, is that the authors of movie novelizations are usually given a certain degree of freedom as far as how they present the story, and any elaborations they want to bring to it. Usually this involves character motivations. Novels, through prose, are able to dive deeper into what drives characters more than movies do, and the Godzilla novelization, written by Stephen Molstad, is no different in this regard, at least from what I can remember from when I first read this over 2 decades ago. Yes, much time has passed since then, and for so many years the novel had been locked away in the vault of my parents' basement. But by the grace of fate, my childhood copy, with its discolored, well-used pages, has returned to me, and so I thought it would be fun to take a trip down memory lane and return to this childhood relic of mine to see how it holds up. How does it differ from the film, if at all? And do these differences make the story better or worse? This won't be an exhaustive and detailed analysis of the book, but more of a broad sweeping look at how it adds to the film in large or small ways. I will be skimming over when the novel and the film sync, as I figure there's no point in going over what we already know. And with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. So the novel opens with a prologue, and as soon as you begin reading, the single biggest difference from the movie is immediately apparent: the framing device. The novel is written in first person, from the perspective of Dr. Nick Tatopoulos, Matthew Broderick's character, which is no big surprise. He is the main protagonist of the film. But what makes this more interesting is that it is presented as a non-fictional recounting after the fact by Nick, as if you, the reader, live in the world of the film, where its events actually happened, and are learning more about it from reading a memoir of sorts from someone who was there to witness it up close. I think this is a pretty cool way to present the story, not just because it changes the context, but because it does so in a way only a novel can. A movie can't do this. The closest equivalent is if the film was a mockumentary. And in doing this, Molstad gives the reader the ability to participate a little. You live in a world where a giant mutated lizard nested in New York, and now you get to learn more about it. It's not a huge thing, but it's clever enough to make these opening pages hook you, at least if you are already familiar with the film. This fictional, non-fictional context changes the way the novel adapts both the French atomic testing and the sinking of the Kobayashi Maru that opened the film. While the film just shows the testing of Polynesia as the credits roll, in the book, Nick goes over how he visited the National Historic Film Archives in Washington, D.C. while writing the book, to watch the film reel of the testing as a form of research. Nick details the footage and notes that it doesn't actually conclusively prove any connection between the tests and Godzilla, but he has visions of being there in a hazmat suit, inspecting lizard eggs and feeling bad that they will probably come out deformed. This adds more subjectivity and a little surrealism to the opening, while also more clearly sets up the framework of Godzilla being a sympathetic creature through the context of Nick's scientific perspective. The sinking of the Kobayashi Maru is also presented as part of the top-secret surveillance footage that Nick had to watch once he was forced onto the project. While detailing it, he stops to talk smack about Japan's overfishing of the oceans, and how he doesn't feel bad that one of their largest fishing vessels is gone. Although it's not really part of the story, I'd like to add a quick note here. Of course, I feel terrible about what happened to the Kobayashi that dark and stormy night, but I'm not sorry Japan is minus one of her super trawlers. These monster-sized boats gobble up and deplete the globe's fish populations at a frightening rate with their vast nets, often also killing whole colonies of dolphins, which swim along with the tuna schools. The endless container rooms of these vessels can hold up to 10 million tons of fish. A good place to work, I suppose, if you enjoy sushi. This will not be the only time Nick steps up onto his environmental soapbox of sorts throughout the novel, and that's because Molstad makes him much more of a tree-hugging environmentalist than he is in the movie. While a bit cliché, it does add another layer to his character, and much like the version seen in the animated series, doesn't have the same vibe as Matthew Broderick's version seen in the film. So between the movie, the novel, and the animated series, there's like 3 different versions of this character. Once we get to Nick in Chernobyl studying earthworms, the novel more closely syncs with the movie, and thus becomes much more of what you'd expect. Nick gets swept away from his project and taken to the attack site in Panama, where he meets Colonel Hicks, Dr. Elsie Chapman, and Dr. Mendel Craven. Here we have our next major difference. Elsie and Mendel are given a lot more characterization, which I know isn't saying much considering how little they are in the film, but that only makes the additions here stand out all the more, especially when it comes to Mendel. He has like 5 lines, I think, in the movie, but here he gets into full-on debates with Elsie, who he has an unrequited crush on, which is a large part of the animated series, so fans of that will feel right at home here. Elsie is presented much more as a vixen in the novel, which Nick notices, referring to her as a very naughty kitten. When the story shifts to New York, Nick sets the stage for the constant downpour of rain that defines the look of the film by again briefly stopping to talk about the environmental issues that he thinks caused it. He mentions how there are many superstitious beliefs about the connection between the rain and Godzilla's appearance, how the laymen believe one heralds the other, which he says is ridiculous before admitting that they are connected, but by the objective measurable effects of man-made global warming and pollution. The first law of environmental science is that all parts of an ecosystem, in this case the global biosphere, are interconnected. Changes in one part of the system can trigger unforeseen consequences in another. I have already explained my belief that exposure to the radiation spread by the atomic testing in French Polynesia gave rise to the creature. Likewise, I think a different sort of pollution is responsible for the unseasonable weather that gripped the Northeast. 2 little words: global warming. In our lust for burning fossil fuels, those syrupy remains of dinosaurs and ancient plants, we are also burning away the Earth's protective ozone layer and making the planet a hotter place to live. My tour of the National Weather Service's webpage turned up another startling piece of information. Over the last 40 years, the average global temperature has increased from 76 degrees to 76.7 degrees. That might not seem very dramatic, but it means that more and more of the world is becoming tropical. Consequently, weather patterns are changing. If we don't begin taking action soon, we might be looking at the end of seasonal patterns altogether. So the rain, just like Godzilla, is a warning from the Earth that if we don't stop polluting and sucking the planet dry of resources, we will pay the price. Godzilla has long been a stand-in for environmental issues, so this is nothing new. This, of course, is when we pop in on Audrey, and the scene is pretty much exactly the same as in the film, setting up her desire to be a reporter and Cayman's attempts to take advantage of this. It's just that it's told as if Nick is recounting it for our benefit. This is how the book is able to break away from the first-person perspective without technically doing so. How he is recounting these scenes in detail down to the dialogue without having been there doesn't really make sense, and it's here where the framing device clashes with the needs of the story and its adherence to the script. It's best not to get too hung up on it because it's going to keep breaking its own rules going forward. Fast forwarding a little, Chapter 2 opens with the scene from the film where Nick, Elsie, Mendel, and Hicks are in a plane discussing what the mysterious massive creature could be, which the book gets a lot more into. Elsie and Mendel debate each other more about whether it could be a dinosaur, with Mendel trying desperately to impress Elsie with his contradicting stance. And it's when Nick brings his points to the debate that a consensus is built. It's not only a longer version of the scene, but better written and characterized, with heavier focus on actual science, or at least the perception of actual science, to give the scene more gravitas. Another difference here is that the scene where Godzilla attacks the 3 fishing boats is removed entirely, and is instead presented here as a quick report Nick reads so as to keep us in his perspective. We now arrive to Godzilla's arrival in Manhattan, which here is presented as a series of anecdotes Nick tells us have been collected over the years from the people who witnessed Godzilla up close and lived to tell their stories. We of course have the story of Shaky Joe, the fisherman from one of the film's most memorable scenes, whose attempts to inexplicably fish in a torrential downpour heralds Godzilla's coming. The scene goes on a little longer, with Godzilla stopping to inspect Joe directly before moving on. Then there's Mayor Ebert's campaign speech, which is pretty much exactly the same, save for a few additional beats. There's Charles Kamen's near miss of Godzilla as it passes by, and here the novel goes a little bit into Kamen's backstory and psychology. Light news days always made Kamen nervous and irritable. It wasn't just that he would have to stretch out the transitions between segments with lots of small talk during the evening's broadcast. It went deeper than that. Some people said he was a news vampire who would begin to starve unless he got his daily quota of juicy stories. But the truth was that even though he had been a fixture at the station for almost 2 decades, he was terrified of losing his job. His reason for living was to be in front of cameras every night. He loved being a celebrity, especially in New York. It gave him the sense of making history instead of merely talking about it all the time. Earlier in his career, he'd entertained hopes of jumping up to one of the network stations and becoming a national figure. But now he was hanging on to the Big Apple by his fingernails, realizing that in a year or two he could be shipped off to an affiliate in Boise or Milwaukee or Pittsburgh. None of this is in the film, of course. It's likely Molstad added this to give Kamen just a smidgen of characterization outside of him just being a misogynistic jerk. After Nick lands in New York following Godzilla's emergence, he secretly wishes Godzilla not be killed before he sees it, due to his own scientific curiosity, once again highlighting his sympathy with the monster. Since the novel is from his point of view, we have a direct line to his thoughts, and get to learn so much more about how he feels about the entire situation, which makes him a more interesting character than the movie version. He sees Godzilla as a victim of our reckless abuse of atomic power, a sentiment that is very half-baked in the final film. Much of what happens through the rest of this chapter plays out pretty much exactly the same as the movie. Philippe bugs Mayor Ebert, Audrey steals Kamen's badge, etc. Chapter 3 opens with a scene in the subway where Audrey and Lucy discuss foraging a fake press ID, and here it goes on a little longer, as Lucy has to negotiate with a school kid for some glue. There's a short scene where everyone at the command center discusses what they should call the creature. Elsie suggests Nick name it, since he was the most correct about what it is. This prompts Nick to take a brief moment in the book to discuss the problematic and inconsistent nature of the name. He notes how it's actually Gojira, and that Godzilla is a mispronunciation butchered by the media, much like his own name. This of course happened in the movie, but the naming happens much earlier here, and becomes much more of a running gag throughout the novel. Nick even notes that titling the book Godzilla was for marketing purposes and against his wishes. He stresses we use the creature's true name, which he does from this point going forward in the book. During the first fish trap to lure Godzilla, Elsie and Mendel are actually there waiting with Nick, and the three actually talk for a bit. So far, I think having Elsie and Mendel be a little more prominent in, well, everything, helps round out the cast a little bit more than the movie, and adds some more scientific flair. Also while waiting, Nick considers what drew Godzilla to Manhattan, with his primary theory being that he simply outgrew his environment. This of course sets up the revelation that he is actually nesting, which is much more of a surprise twist in the film. These scientific interludes are consistently where the novel is at its best, because it makes the story feel more grounded, which, as anyone who has seen the film, is pretty illogical in a lot of ways. But also, as I mentioned before, improve on Nick as a character. He just seems a little more intelligent in the novel, precisely because we are given a window into his thinking. When Godzilla finally emerges from underground in front of Nick, he takes a moment to take in the monster's appearance, and as he breaks it down for us, he notes how it seems like he is an amalgamation of a crocodile, iguana, Komodo dragon, and birds. He even theorizes that the largest main spines on his shoulders could have been a failed attempt at wings. My mind was racing with questions about this strangely deformed and mutated creature, which I felt must have been the result of exposure to gene-warpingly high levels of atomic fallout. Its body seemed to be a hodgepodge of parts from other animals. The head and neck of a crocodile, the brawny rear limbs of a Komodo dragon, the dorsal armor and spindly fingers of an iguana. He also had certain avian or bird-like characteristics. The three-toed feet resembled the heavy slashing claws of an ostrich. Also, the armored plates extending from the shoulder blades looked like a stunted set of wings, which, after failing to grow, had turned to bony stumps. He had muscular control over the two main armored plates, but most of the time let them flop loosely back and forth as he walked. His arms were held close to his chest, like a boxer's. The idea that this Godzilla is a hybrid, a merging and mutation of multiple species into one, is really interesting, since it runs contrary to the widely held belief that he is simply a mutated iguana, which the film even implies. When the military attacks and all hell breaks loose, the novel attempts to keep the story grounded in Nick's perspective by having him listen to everything happening over the radio, which he of course recounts to us, the reader. During this, he briefly goes over the scientific explanation of the power breath, the closest thing to atomic breath this Godzilla gets. He inhaled deeply, causing a dramatic expansion of his own ribcage. Then he forced the air out of his mighty lungs, generating a gale-force wind. This phenomenon, which I would later be unlucky enough to observe firsthand, has come to be called the power breath. And, however shocking this behavior might be to herpetologists, it should be noted that there are very good anatomical reasons for its being possible. Aquatic reptiles, as is well known, have extremely well-developed lungs, and are capable of spending long periods of time submerged in water. Owners of iguanas and various dragon-like reptiles report their pets sometimes heave great hissing sighs, but never had they seen this great breathing ability used as a defensive mechanism. Just as he does in the film, Godzilla gets the upper hand on Echo Unit. Echo 4 actually lasts a little longer here, and he shows more courage and a willingness to stand and fight than the film version, who attempts to run as soon as possible. Following this, Nick heads to the pharmacy to purchase pregnancy tests, and in a small difference from the film, he notices a vendor selling shirts with animals' footage of Godzilla printed on them. It's a small little world-building detail that is appreciated. Once Nick and Audrey unite, the novel spends a little time diving into the backstory of how Nick and Audrey actually met and fell apart, which is left more ambiguous in the film. You see, Audrey and I had met when our campus newspaper sent her to cover a protest rally I had organized. There had been an instant attraction, a chemical bonding. We became inseparable pals, and one thing led to another. We practically lived at each other's apartments, and 4 years later, on the verge of graduating, we were still going strong. At least, I thought so. One morning, we were walking up the hill to class. I told her how much I loved her, and how much I couldn't imagine my life without her, and asked her to be my wife. To show you how out of touch with reality I was expecting her to say, "Yes, of course I'll marry you, Nick darling," without even blinking. Instead, she reacted with shock and told me she'd need some time to think it over. She had to decide whether she wanted to spend the rest of her life with a guy whose idea of a hot Saturday night was renting a National Geographic video about gastropods. It's excellent, by the way. She didn't say how much time she would need to mull the question over, but it was apparently quite a while because I hadn't seen or spoken to her since that day. Rather than do the right thing and tell me the truth, Audrey skipped town. She even missed the graduation ceremony so she wouldn't have to face me. Who wouldn't be angry? After Nick leaves Audrey in his tent and she steals his tape, he returns to find her gone, and thinks she's abandoned him for being the boring worm guy again. The added backstory combined with Nick's perspective allows the book to add some more layers to Nick and Audrey's relationship. He thinks she left him because he is a boring science guy, and her leaving again right as they reunite only reaffirms this in his eyes. Obviously, the film doesn't go into any of this, and thus is why their relationship falls flat. It's still nothing special here, but the added perspective of Nick adds some vulnerability, and gives the reader a bit more reason to care. The book pulls the curtain back a bit on Audrey's research into her stolen story on Godzilla. She does some digging online, which in 1998, without Google, is a whole different experience, kids, and discovers that Gojira is the name given to a Japanese mythological seafaring chimera that attacks ships. There's even a sailor's prayer to go with it. Massively you dwell, O dragon of the triple world, in the great iron cage of the sea. But when the dead mists of the half-eaten moon stir the waters and open your cage, you rise in effulgent glory, a great flash of livingness, eye and wind, tongue and water, to swallow the wayward sailor's floating world. Spare our ship, O dragon, remain embedded in stone. Humbly we speak your name, Gojira. 16th century, Japanese sailor's prayer. This, aside from a very brief mention, isn't in the film, and is thus one of the most distinct differences between it and its novelization. By doing this, Molstad adds more historical and mythological elements to Godzilla that, while admittedly a bit half-baked, is certainly a step up from the film version, which gives almost no concern to the name or its connection to the Japanese. So while it's not particularly inspired, we'll take what we can get. Following this, everything plays out here pretty much the same. Nick delivers his theory about Godzilla's pregnancy, and Kamen's stolen WIDF news report plays out. A small difference is that, as Nick tells us, Audrey had to be pulled kicking and screaming out of the bar by Animal where they were watching the report. In the film, she's much more reserved and just plain dumbstruck. Nick gets the boot off the Godzilla task force, and he's super bummed about it. Again, being in his head here allows us to feel a little more how this is all affecting him. He spirals a bit, wondering if his earthworm study study, his passion project, is over. Once it becomes clear the taxi isn't taking him to the airport because it's being driven by Philippe, he even fears he's being taken out permanently. Fast forwarding a little once more, when Nick and Philippe are going over their plan to infiltrate the city to take out the nest, Philippe calls the monster Godzilla, and Nick corrects him that it's Gojira. Philippe obviously doesn't care. As far as I know, Philippe never actually refers to Godzilla by name in the film. It's a small thing, but plays into the butchering of the name gag that the novel leans heavily into. Also in this scene, Philippe's men hear evidence of animals spying on them, and even send some guys to search, but find nothing. The novel goes into a little detail with regards to the logistics of how they infiltrate the city, especially Animal and Audrey. Apparently, Lucy has a brother who works for the Port Authority, and it's through him that they figure out a way into the city. Later on, the two have to walk around landmines, the military place, to keep Godzilla from using the tunnels. Now we come to Godzilla's second encounter with the military, and the biggest change is how the monster approaches the fish trap. Whereas in the film, he slowly and cautiously approaches the bait in Central Park, in the novel, he is quick and cautious, darting between buildings for cover. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this whole sequence, which for the most part is the same as the film, is how it describes Godzilla when he jumps into the Hudson River. He is described as attempting to fly with his dorsal fins, which Nick says is another clue to his origins. The pilots remarked that as he soared through the sky, the keeled plates on his shoulder blades flapped like wings. These bony fins were, of course, far too small to affect the creature's aerodynamics, but this attempt to fly was an intriguing clue about his mysterious ancestry. The same genetic memory that makes a flightless barnyard chicken flap its wings when in danger must have been at work in the brain of this overlarge reptile. With a tremendous splash, he broke the surface of the Hudson River and plunged into its murky depths. The novel suggests far more than the film does that Godzilla is an amalgamation of multiple creatures, not just a mutated iguana, which again is the most common and long-standing interpretation. Later on, when Nick and Philippe find the eggs, Nick inspects the shell, noting the texture, color, and design, and discovers the shell is infested with mutated parasitic worms. When they discover that Godzilla has laid hundreds of eggs, Nick is shocked because lizards don't lay that many eggs, but then he deduces that it must be because of crocodilian DNA. This is supported by his observation of the baby Godzilla's teeth, which he notes implies crocodilian origin. Again, these little scientific asides, which are mostly absent from the film, are nice because they help ground the story a bit more and make it less goofy and more believable. Obviously, making Godzilla an animal is a controversial choice to say the least, but if you're gonna do it all the way. And it's through these details that the novel does make Godzilla feel more like an animal. Once the baby Godzillas hatch, they don't attack as quickly as they do in the film. In fact, when Nick and Philippe lock themselves in a room, the babies are still creeping up alongside them, inquisitive, but not yet hostile. And while Nick is the one to realize they smell like fish in the film, it is actually one of Philippe's men, Jean-Marc, who is the one to realize he smells of fish right before he dies. As Nick and Philippe attempt to maneuver their way around the hungry baby Godzillas, Nick hopes that, since most larger reptiles are actually cannibalistic, that the babies will follow suit and be so hungry that they begin eating each other. Seeing as how Nick wasn't there to witness the deaths of Jean-Luc and Jean-Claude, they are given only passing mention here as he quickly recalls how later on Philippe informed him on how they died. Speeding along a little, there are some extra character beats during Nick and Audrey's broadcast to the military. Philippe takes a moment to warn Nick not to mention him and his men before he gets on camera, and Nick is much more visibly and audibly nervous on camera than in the film. Also, the baby Godzillas begin attacking before the feed is over, creating a little more tension. When Elsie and Mendel see the broadcast, they actually physically pull Hicks from whatever he's doing to the television to see the feed, which I thought was kind of humorous given how much of a commanding presence Hicks has. Following the message to the outside, the mad dash to escape before Madison Square Garden is blown up begins. And before the group rappels down from the broadcast booth, Audrey kisses Nick. "Just in case I don't have a chance to do this later," she says. This is different from the film, where their first kiss doesn't happen until after the babies have been dispensed with. Taco Bell gets a shout out, which definitely can't be a coincidence. Once Madison Square Garden is destroyed, Nick describes how he can hear the cries of the baby Godzillas burning alive, which is pretty messed up. Nick is relieved, of course, but feels sorry for exterminating a new species. So again, Nick's scientific interest in Godzilla is much more apparent here than in the film. Right after this, when Godzilla reveals himself to be very much still alive, the novel describes him to be much more outwardly damaged by the submarines than in the film. And when Godzilla inspects his dead young, he howls in sadness that hits Nick in his feels. It sounded like a cry of suffering. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. He was screaming out in pain over the bodies of his dead children. The sound cut through me like a cold blade and resonated in some primordial part of my nervous system. For the first time, I thought I saw an expression cross the huge saurian's face. The nostrils flared, the nictitating membranes closed over the eyes, and the lower jaw quivered. It was impossible not to feel a pang of sympathy for this poor, grieving father, and my heart would have gone out to him except for one thing. He was going to kill us. Again, descriptions like this help humanize Godzilla in a way that I feel like the film doesn't. It wants you to feel bad for him, but doesn't put in enough work to achieve this effect, at least not as satisfactorily as it could have, and then contradicts this attempt at sympathy in boneheaded ways. This tonal whiplash is one of the film's major failings, and while the novel doesn't avoid this either, these little moments most it adds do help. Another humanizing moment comes right before Godzilla gets gunned down on the Brooklyn Bridge. Godzilla actually hears the F-18s approaching and realizes it's a trap, but revenge takes priority over self-preservation, and so he continues to give chase, much to his own doom. Once Godzilla begins being barraged by missiles, Nick thinks about the innocent natural impulses that drove him to Manhattan, to his death, allowing the reader to sympathize with him in his final moments. As Godzilla lies dying, Nick wants to comfort him as he takes his final breaths. I felt like rushing over to him and trying to offer him some comfort. I wanted to explain that we'd only done what we had to do. The Earth just wasn't big enough for both our species. But in the end, I just stood there, and then he was dead. Just as the novel had a prologue that didn't exist in the film, so too does it have an epilogue. It begins with Nick bringing it back to the environmental issues that he can't help sermoning about. He explains how Godzilla could just be the beginning, that if we continue ruining the planet, more similar anomalies could appear. He even name drops King Kong. Following this, we get a glimpse into the characters' lives after Godzilla that the film never got into. Audrey becomes a reporter at another major news station. Elsie is put in charge of dissecting Godzilla's body for study. Mendel is capitalizing on the event by writing a science fiction pseudo-sequel book where Godzilla lays a smaller cache of eggs on a remote island. Philippe's role is actually made public. He is declared a hero by his country and then subsequently fired. He sends a humorous postcard to Nick. And Nick returns to his study of the Chernobyl earthworms, and the Darwin quote that opens the book is revealed to be about earthworms, bringing everything full circle. It's actually kind of clever. And of course, Nick and Audrey are back together. She immediately begins to show more interest in Nick's work, which is a contrast to her lack of interest that initially was one of the major reasons she bailed 8 years ago. She is even revealed to be the one who pulled the Darwin quote, so things are looking quite good for the couple. The novel concludes the same way as the movie, with a single hidden baby Godzilla egg hatching, but here it is presented as a vision Nick has, a gut feeling that the threat may not be over, inspired by Mendel's fiction book. And so concludes the novelization. So is it better than the film? Well, technically I'd say yes, in the sense that there are small additions that make the story and the characters a little better. In a straight comparison, sure, I'd say the novel is better. However, none of these additions are substantive enough to make much of a difference overall. The novel is very true to the film, much more so than other movie novelizations I've read, and the differences, as I've outlined here, are so small as to not move the needle all that much. The single biggest difference is the framing device of Nick's perspective, but it doesn't actually change much. At most, it just adds some flavoring to the story in a way that, if you're a fan of the film, which I assume you are if you are reading this book, you'll appreciate. But outside of this, it doesn't change enough to make the novelization a true revelation of any kind. Still, I'd say this is an above average novelization. Stephen Molstad's writing is satisfactory, neither challenging nor facile, and its simplicity makes for easy, light reading that most people can pick up and enjoy. I got through the book real quick, which is a good thing. This is what you want in a movie tie-in novel. They are, by their nature, meant to appeal to the less voracious readers, people who may pick up a book every so often if it's based on something else they are interested in. So if you're a fan of Godzilla, especially this Godzilla, I'd say take a crack at it. Check your local library and see if they have a copy. I've enjoyed turning the page back, so to speak, to take a look back at this relic of my upbringing, and I hope you have too. If you have, please take the time to leave a comment and/or like this video. It really helps, and I appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and as always, long live the king.